Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview English podcaster Mr. Stephen Toplis. Mr. Toplis is on the Nottingham Forest related podcast 1865, the Nottingham Forest podcast. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on Nottingham Forest Champions Cup winning run in the 1978-79 season. Hello, Stephen. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me on. Great to be
Thank you.
here.
Thank you. Can you please introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
So my background in football is started watching it as a kid when I was 6, 7 years old, taken to my first Forest game at that point, and that's where it all started. Really, it was at that point all about Forest and supporting them. They're my local team. I'm from Nottingham, so they're my hometown club, and that was it really. That's once you get into football at that age, you become obsessed with it, and you start reading about the current team. You start reading about the history of the teams that came before it and of the club. And obviously, in Forest's case, there was quite a bit of history before I started supporting them. And over the years, I got into journalism. That's what I studied at university. So had a couple of years working in sports journalism, and then it got into podcasting, and eventually 1865, where we talk about all of the latest events at Forest and what's going on at the club, match reports, roundups, that kind of thing. And obviously the club are now back in the Premier League after a long absence. So it's good watching Forest again. It's been quite a few years in the doldrums, but we're back, and it's enjoyable to see them back at the top table again after so long.
So, before we discuss the events of the 1978-79 season, let's rewind and go back a few seasons with the arrival of the legendary Brian Clough in January 1975, with Nottingham Forest still in the second division. Can you discuss those few years with between his arrival and his Champions Cup run?
So Brian Clough arrives 6th of January 1975, and at that point Forest are a struggling mid-table team in the second division, or nowadays the championship, not really going anywhere. The previous manager was a chap called Alan Brown. They'd had a run to the FA Cup the year before, the quarterfinals, but they hadn't really done a lot in the league. They were relegated from the top division in 1972 and never really looked like getting back there in the years that followed. So Brian Clough comes in. This is his first job as a manager since the famous 44-day spell at Leeds United, where he'd replaced Don Revie, but obviously lasted 6 weeks and was gone. And I think at that point, Clough was seen as damaged goods. I think clubs were reluctant to take him on because of what happened at Leeds and because of how things ended at Derby County. There was rumoured fallouts with the chairman. Clough was very vocal in the media and a bit of a TV personality outside of football. So I think at that point, Forest were taking a bit of a chance on him, but in Forest's position, it was a chance worth taking. So he comes in, wins his first game, an FA Cup third round replay at Spurs. But Forest in that first season or first half season with Clough finish 16th. So not particularly notable. In his second season, they finish 8th. But this is the point when you start to see Clough just beginning to put his stamp on things. So not long after he joins Forest, John McGovern, who was his captain at Derby and who had gone with him to Leeds, he comes to Forest to link up with Clough again. And John O'Hare, the striker, he does the same. He'd been with him at Derby, then at Leeds. Obviously hadn't worked out at Leeds, so he joins Clough as well at Forest. And that's the early signs of Clough just adding his stamp to things at the City ground. And then a few more players come in. So 1976, he signs Larry Lloyd, initially on loan from Coventry. Lloyd, who'd been playing at Liverpool a few years earlier, winning titles. He'd won an England cap as well. So he'd got plenty of pedigree, but Clough persuaded him to join Forest. And it was those kind of signings that were just starting to lay the foundations for what was to come over the next few years. So Clough in his first full season, finishes 8th in the second division. And then in the summer of 1976, he's joined once again by Peter Taylor, who'd been his assistant at Derby, and they'd achieved incredible things there, taking Derby out the second division, winning the first division title with them. Taylor had been at Brighton, where Clough had a brief spell before joining Leeds, between Derby and Leeds. Taylor stayed at Brighton to manage them on his own, while Clough went off to Leeds and then to Forest. The two of them link up again in the summer of 76, and that's when it all starts, really. The rise begins. So in that first season, Forest finished 3rd in the second division, and in doing so, win promotion. Although it is a little bit on a knife edge, because they were relying on Bolton Wanderers to basically lose their last couple of games to get promoted. They played Wolves at the old Burnden Park. Wolves were already promoted. They were champions. They beat Bolton by a goal to 0. At this point, Forest had played all of their fixtures for the season. This was how things worked back then. You know, teams didn't all play together on the last day sometimes. Forest are on their way to Calamalor, Mallorca on a post-season break, and they're on the plane flying over to Mallorca when the pilot tells them that Wolves have beaten Bolton and Forest are promoted. So a great achievement. Forest are in the first division by the skin of their teeth, really, when you look at it. And then in the summer of 1977, Forest sign Kenny Burns from Birmingham City, who had played as a centre-half earlier in his career, but was mainly a striker. And he was seen as a bit of a bad boy of football, had a reputation off the pitch. On the pitch, he was known as a bit of a hard man. But Clough and Taylor saw something in him to play him as a centre-back alongside Larry Lloyd. And that decision just turned out to be a masterstroke. The two of them were an effective partnership, and Burns was a very effective central defender. And other signings as well, Forest made, albeit a little bit into the season now. So Forest signed Archie Gemmell from Derby County a few games in. Gemmell was another member of the Derby title-winning team under Brian Clough, another player that he's worked with very well in the past. So Archie Gemmell comes in, really hard-working but quite cultured midfielder, really good passer of the ball and a real competitor in that midfield, and brought some experience, which really the Forest team was lacking, that top-level experience at the time. So, you know, players like McGovern and Gemmell were vital to bring that to the team. And a few games in as well, Peter Shilton signs from Stoke City. Forest pay a decent fee for him, at the region of £400,000, which was a lot of money back then. But Clough and Taylor had admired Shilton for years, and he was seen as the final piece of the jigsaw, really, to give Forest that push to get into the first division and the higher to get more established in the first division. And straight away, Shilton comes in, and it all just goes from there. Forest go on a long unbeaten run, which stretches into the next season as well. 42 league games unbeaten. And they go on, they win the League Cup in that first season back, albeit without Shilton because he's cup tied. But they beat Liverpool twice. They beat Liverpool in the final after a replay. So the first game at Wembley finishes goalless. And then in the replay, they beat Liverpool, who are the all-conquering side of the day, 1-0, thanks to a John Robertson penalty. And then after that, they go on and win the league title. The famous moment that they win the title is at Coventry, and it's Shilton who pulls off some incredible saves, one in particular in the second half, which has been replayed over and over, where centre forward comes in on a header. He's about 3 yards out, and Shilton somehow tips it over the bar. And Forest are champions in the first season back, which is an incredible achievement, almost unthinkable in any era of football. But Forest do it. They are the first team since, I think, Ipswich in 1962 to come up and win the league in the first season back. And that means that they go into the European Cup for the next season for the first time in their history. And it's worth noting as well that the first division title that they win, that's the first time they've won that in their history too.
Going into this 1978-79 season, what were the state of the affairs at Nottingham Forest?
I think the club's in a healthy place at that point, still riding the crest of a wave that they're on, really. People obviously wrote them off when they were promoted. And even during the previous season, while they're going along well and sitting top of the table and winning week in, week out, the media were predicting that the wheels will come off at some point. Bob Wilson, the former Arsenal goalkeeper who was a summariser on Match of the Day, he famously said that Forest's bubble will burst. It never did. Of course, they win the league. And I think going into that 78 summer, everyone's just enjoying the ride. Everyone's optimistic. Probably still can't believe what's happened as well, that they've won the league and won a League Cup as well. But then looking forward to the next campaign and how they can build on it. And obviously looking forward to the club's first ever European Cup campaign.
How was the transfer activity in the off-season viewed?
It was a surprise that Forest decided to sell Peter Withe. He'd been with the club from the second division days, and he'd struck up a really good partnership with Tony Woodcock up front. The two of them were key elements in Forest winning the league title. So for Withe to move on like that was a bit of a surprise. He was still mid-20s, plenty of years left in the tank. He obviously went on to Aston Villa later in his career and won the European Cup himself, scored the winning goal. So selling him to Newcastle for £200,000 was seen as a surprise, but Brian Clough wasn't afraid to make those kind of decisions and surprise us by bringing in unknown players to replace the likes of Withe and give those players the opportunity to step up. The replacement for Peter Withe was a chap called Steve Elliott, who was an academy player at Forest. He'd come through the ranks, seen as a very talented player, but plays the first 3 or 4 games of the season and can't score a goal. So at that point, that's where Gary Birtles comes in. And Gary Birtles was a Forest player since 1976, but he joined from a local non-league team. He'd come in and he was working as a carpet fitter and playing non-league football for Long Eaton United. Forest signed him for £2,000 and he hadn't really made a breakthrough at that point. He was just sat in the reserves, really. And then Clough gives him his chance, and that's where it all goes from there, really. And he doesn't look back. The 78-79 season for Forest starts with the Charity Shield against Ipswich Town, who had won the FA Cup in 1978. So it was league champions against FA Cup winners. And Forest win that 5-0 at Wembley. And one of Peter Withe's, I think it might have been his last game for Forest. So it was the last game, really, that that 77-78 title-winning team played. With was on the score sheet himself. John Robertson, Martin O'Neill scored the goals as well. And Forest, in the end, made it a very comfortable afternoon and added another trophy in the form of the Charity Shield. And that just set them up for the rest of the season at that point.
So let's look at the backbone of the team. Let's look at the standard formation and lineup of the squad. So we have Shilton in goal. In defense, we have Viv Anderson on the right. We have Lloyd and Burns, or sometimes Needham at the center, and Frank Clark or Colin Barrett on the left. In midfield, we have the likes of O'Neill, Martin O'Neill, the Northern Ireland International, McGovern, Ian Boyer, and Robertson on the left. And up front, we have Birtles and Woodcock. Was this more or less the formation for the near future?
That was basically the team, a 4-4-2 formation, that solid back four of Anderson, Burns, Lloyd, and Clark. And that midfield as well largely stayed the same. So, yeah, you mentioned Martin O'Neill. He played on the right of the midfield. John McGovern would wear the number 4 shirt. He'd be centre midfield, almost playing like a bit like a holding midfielder, really. And then next to him would typically be either Ian Bowyer or Archie Gemmell as the slightly more attacking of that central midfield too. And then the left-hand side, John Robertson, who is widely considered to be the greatest player in Forest history. Everything in the team went through him. The instruction from Clough was give the ball to Robertson and he'll make things happen. He could beat a player. Wasn't the quickest in terms of speed or pace, but could beat a player over a couple of yards and swing in across with accuracy and create goals for the likes of Woodcock, With, and Birtles. But he was also a very good penalty taker. And the League Cup final, for example, it's his penalty that wins the cup for Forest. In the European campaign, he takes a few crucial penalties. And throughout his Forest career was a regular source of goals, both scoring them and setting them up for others. So he was very much a fulcrum of the team from that left-hand side. And then up from Tony Woodcock and Peter With or Gary Birtles for this campaign were the two strikers. And Forest very rarely deviated from that. It was a 4-4-2. The players knew exactly what their jobs were. And it was a solid platform for all of those players to perform, really. And Clough was very simple in his instructions. The players talk about how easily he broke the game down. He didn't overcomplicate things, made them clear of what their jobs were, what was expected of them. And in that 4-4-2 formation, they just swept all before them in that first season back in the first division and then built on it when they went into Europe. And those certainly in Nottingham and anybody associated with Forest, that starting 11 has gone into legend.
And let's mention that Peter Shilton's backup was the teenage Chris Woods, future England goalkeeper.
Yeah, and he plays as well in the League Cup final. He comes in as an 18-year-old, having played very little first-team football aside from the League Cup that season, puts in a man-of-the-match performance and keeps Forest in that tournament in the final and helps them eventually go on to win it in the replay. And obviously, Chris Woods went on to have a long career with Rangers and Norwich and England. And amazing, really, that you've basically got the two England goalkeepers of the next 15 years, both at the club at the same time.
Now let's look at the Champions Cup run itself. For the first round in September, Nottingham Forest is paired with the most difficult opponent of all, Liverpool. the double defending champions of the trophy, the great Liverpool of Bob Paisley. We can name them all: Souness, Dalglish, Ray Clemens, Phil Neal, Emlyn Hughes, Jimmy Case, Tim McDermott, and on and on and on. At this point, we have to mention that Liverpool were on top of the league with 5 wins out of 5, and were just scoring freely, while I think Forest were struggling early on at this point, somewhat. Nevertheless, Bob Paisley stated that it would be a different matchup in Europe, and felt that Clough would make it difficult for them. The first leg was at the City Ground on September 13th. Forest would win 2-0, with Gary Birtles opening the scoring at the 27th minute. Near the end, Colin Barrett scored the second crucial goal. Forest started on a good foot, but nothing was still decided yet as far as the press was concerned.
No, I think the overriding feeling ahead of the tie was that, yep, Forest might have won the league, they might have won the League Cup, but they've had their fun now, and Liverpool will put them back in their place. And as it was going into this tie, and when the draw was made, the Forest players were looking forward to a trip to mainland Europe, going to Spain or Germany or France or somewhere like that. And the first opponents are Liverpool, who they've played 4 times the previous season. And I think they were quite looking forward to getting away and venturing a bit further out. But as it was Liverpool. And I think the players at the time were sort of saying, oh, no, not them again. But Brian Clough spun that on its head and said to his players, well, Liverpool are going to be saying exactly the same about you. Forest played them 4 times in League and Cup in that 77-78 season and didn't lose to them, and beat them in the final of the League Cup. So Forest had become a bit of a bogey side for Liverpool. Like you say, they were all conquering and sweeping teams away. And Forest just found that way of playing against them and frustrating them. And it came out again in this tie. So that 2-0 first leg win was massive to give Forest something to hold on to at Anfield. Gary Birtles, that was his first goal as a Forest player. So the early season troubles that the team had in scoring goals and winning games, once Gary Birtles started scoring, that was solved. And then the Colin Barrett goal has gone down as one of the most famous in Forest history. Colin Barrett's playing as a left back, and late in the game ventures forward to join the attack, much to the disbelief of Clough and Taylor on the touchline, finds himself in the middle of the penalty area, ball drops to him and he volleys it into the top corner. And that's a huge goal. It gives Forest a 2-goal advantage going to Anfield and a bit more confidence going into that second leg that they can hold out and get through to the next round, which they did. And on the way to the ground, on the team bus, Brian Clough gave the players a beer each just to relax them. You'd never get away with it now, but back then it was very different. That was his way of calming the players down, relaxing them and trying to take the pressure out of the situation. And they go to Anfield. They have to play a more battling game and really shut Liverpool down. Shilton makes some big saves from Kenny Dalglish, a couple of really good ones. And Forest come away from there with a 0-0 draw. And not only are they through to the next round of the competition, but they've knocked out Liverpool on their own pitch, the double champions, defending champions. And that was quite a notable result, because not only did it bring to an end Liverpool's dominance of the competition, I think it gave the Forest players the belief that they needed to go on and win the competition themselves. And the story is that Bob Paisley even said that to the Forest players, you can go on and win this now. And I think it did give them that confidence and belief that they could go on and lift the trophy themselves.
And let's mention a few things. After the first leg, Bob Paisley blamed his tactics. He said that against the continental side, they would have closed down the match at 1-0 to have a chance for the return leg. However, against Forest, they treated it like an FA Cup match and just continued attacking, and that opened space and the second goal. After the elimination, Paisley referred to Forest as the most continental of English sides. Clough also stated that Liverpool threw everything at us except the Ducks. So he believed that this victory was important for his side to realize their true dimension. And I think we'll discuss this later, but this may have been, like you said, the catalyst for their belief that they would win the title at the end of the season, because they basically defeated the best team of them all.
I think that's it. To go and knock out a team as good as Liverpool, it's once you've done that, you can beat anybody.
The next round, in comparison, was a formality. They played the Greek side, AEK Athens, managed by the great Ferenc Puskas. The first leg at Athens, Forest won 2-1. McGovern and Bertels scored the goals. The return leg at November 1st at the City Ground, Nottingham Forest won 5-1 with Needham, Woodcock, Viv Anderson, and Bertels scoring a double. So this was a routine win for Forest. In fact, it maybe was too easy for them. The only talking point was the situation with Larry Lloyd. Apparently, after the first leg in Athens, he had not worn the official club blazers on the trip home. And this somehow did not sit down well with the management. There was question that he might not play in the second leg. But in the end, he captained in McGovern's absence. But otherwise, it was an easy win for Forest against an inferior opposition.
Yeah, I think for Forest, this one was just about getting the job done, really. The first leg in Athens, the crowd was hostile and raucous, as you expect in Athens, but Forest dealt with that, gave themselves a comfortable second leg, really, by getting those two away goals. And yeah, you mentioned the Larry Lloyd story there. I think another example that of Brian Clough just bringing his players back down to earth a bit and not letting them get too carried away. The story is, yeah, that he doesn't wear the official club blazer, and Clough's not very happy with it. But I think he, again, was just doing that to try and keep the players on the ground and stop them from getting too ahead of themselves. In the second leg, they come out and it's quite a comfortable evening for them in the end, with the goals, as you say, finishes 5-1. There's some nice goals in there. Viv Anderson bombs forward and outside of his boot curls a lovely shot into the top corner from 20 yards. So Forest were beginning to really enjoy themselves, I think, and enjoy these European trips to start playing the level of football that they do and make it quite comfortable for themselves in some of these home games. That starts to emerge, certainly when they go into the next round as well against Grasshoppers. The home leg plays out in a similar fashion.
In mid-season on February 9th, 1979, a month before these quarterfinals against Grasshoppers, we have the £1 million signing of Trevor Francis from Birmingham City. Can you discuss all the stories surrounding this important transfer?
So Trevor Francis was playing for Birmingham City. He was regarded as one of the best young players in English football when he broke into the Birmingham team. and throughout the 70s was Birmingham's main player. He was an attacking midfielder / forward, and Clough and Taylor had always admired him. Another player that they'd always wanted to work with. So when the opportunity came and Birmingham were willing to sell, it was a choice between Coventry City or Forest for Trevor Francis. And I think Coventry were offering a better package for him personally in terms of finances, but he said he couldn't turn down the opportunity to work for Brian Clough. The story is that even though he's known as the first £1 million footballer, Clough wouldn't pay £1 million. He paid £999,999 to basically stop the fee going to Francis's head and try and take a bit of the pressure off him. The tax on the deal eventually does take it over the £1 million mark, but nevertheless, it's the start of an interesting relationship between Clough and Francis. The day of the signing, February the 9th, 1979, Brian Clough invites the TV cameras down to capture the signing and Francis joining the club. Clough, at this point, was across the road playing squash, as he usually did during the week. And he comes into this press conference with his shiny jacket on, carrying his squash racket, and just pops his squash racket down on the table and sits down to Trevor Francis and, goes through the deal and they sign the contract there and then. But just another example of Clough's unique way of dealing with a situation, quite a high profile situation. And at the time, Forest hadn't signed anybody for 14 months. David Needham in December 77 was their last signing, if you exclude players coming through the academy. So Francis comes in for £1 million, and the story is that in one of the next couple of games that Forest play after his signing, Francis can't play. So Brian Clough gets him to make the tea for the players at half time. So you've basically got £1 million tea boy who's at half time going round and, making the tea and serving his teammates almost. And again, I think that was a way of Brian Clough bringing him down to earth and making sure he didn't get too carried away by the situation.
We have to specify that Francis's signing took place too late to make him eligible for the quarterfinals and the semifinals. And at this point, he would have only been eligible for the final match, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
So the quarterfinal matchups were against Suicide Grasshopper Zurich. In the end, these also ended up as rather comfortable. The first leg on March 7th, Nottingham Forest won 4-1. Actually, Grasshopper took the lead in the 11th minute through Claudio Sulcer. Bertels tied a match in the 31st minute. John Robertson scored a spot kick in the 47th minute. And near the end, Archie Gemmell and Larry Lloyd scored 2 goals to put the result beyond doubt, put the tie beyond doubt. We have to point out that when the score was 2-1, Peter Shilton had an excellent save in the 75th minute from Sulcer. And Clough called this the turning point of the match. And it was after this that Forest scored the 2 late goals. The return leg on March 21st, no one really expected Zurich to score 3 goals, and it would end up as a 1-1 tie. Sulcer scored again through penalty kick in the 33rd minute, and Martin O'Neill tied the match in the 38th minute. I assume the only takeaway from these ties is that Raimundo Ponte caught Brian Clough's eye, and he would be signed sometime later in 1980, I believe.
Yeah, he joins Forest a few years later, and was a very classy player, Raimondo Ponte, although his Forest career never really hit the heights in terms of winning trophies or honours. But again, another very cultured player, and a player that Forest wouldn't have been able to sign normally. It's through the profile of winning the trophies and the European Cups that they're able to attract players of that caliber. So that just shows you what this couple of years does to Forest's standing. And yeah, it gives them the options to sign players like Ponte and dip into the European market for players that really do bring something different to what was in the Forest team at that time. And in later years, you see the likes of Johnny Method, Hans van Breukelen come in from Europe and really make an impact for Forest. So, yeah, it's interesting to see Clough eventually dipping into that European market.
The semifinals were against West German side FC Köln, managed by the legendary Hennes Weisweiler, featuring players like Harald Schumacher and Bernd Schuster, amongst others. This could have been Forrest's undoing. Was there any particular apprehension before the matches?
Not really, actually. There's a funny story about this where Peter Taylor had done a scouting trip to see Cologne before the first leg, and he came back and said, "Don't worry, lads, you'll hammer them. They've got no pace, they can't play, and you'll beat them. Don't worry." Now, I don't know if that was a bit of kidology to try and relax the Forest players and just get the Forest players focused purely on their game and how they wanted to play. But they turned out to be famous last words. And in that first leg, Forest are 2-0 down within 20 minutes and Cologne are running rings around them. And yes, I think that was a lesson learned by everybody that, yes, while it's good to big up your players, sometimes you have got to give the opposition credit and respect before you get out on the pitch, because it can come back to bite you.
And that was an awful pitch, emblematic of the era. That first
Yeah,
leg, yeah.
it was there was heavy rain in Nottingham in the days before, which basically turns the pitch into a quagmire. And when you watch the footage back, it's unbelievable, really. Even amongst those conditions, the quality of football is still very good, and it makes for an incredible match. This game is widely regarded as the best game ever played at the City Ground. Both the players who played in it say the atmosphere was incredible, and obviously the game itself was amazing, and the fans as well who were there, they look back fondly on this game and remember it as one of the very best ever staged at the City Ground.
But at the end of the match, Clough was very furious with Peter Shilton, who, according to the player himself, was responsible for 2 of the goals. We have to mention that after falling behind, Forest staged a fight back and get ahead 3-2, but just before the end, Cole scores a third goal. And at this point, one would have assumed they seemingly had the advantage as the away team, etc. But Forest had other ideas. So the second leg was on April 25th, and Clough had declared that Forest would qualify. We forgot to mention that Forest were from the first leg. They were missing Burns and Viv Anderson, and that kind of destabilized the defense in that first leg as well. This time they were back, and it was much more the standard Forest formation in this second leg. Clough's tactics for this match was to attack Cole aerially, as he had sensed the weakness in that area from the first leg. So the match was more or less balanced in the first half. In the second half, Forest scored a winner. There's a corner kick from the left side taken by Robertson. I believe Bertels flicks it backwards and Boyer heads it in. Yeah, and Nottingham Forest win and advance to the final. What was your takeaway from this match?
Again, the way that Forest can defy the odds, it's something that they'd done under Clough quite a few times up to that point, and they did it again after the first leg. And particularly Cologne scoring that third goal, the third away goal. I think everybody thought, well, that's it for Forest. They've blown it, and they're not going to go to Cologne and get the win and get the result they need to go through. But Brian Clough, like you say, he was bullish before. He said that Forest would win, and they had a really good knack of grinding out results when they needed to. So they did it at Anfield earlier in the campaign to get that 0-0. And they did it again here in Cologne to not only score the goal that they needed to, but they held firm against Cologne pressure and made life difficult for them to book their place in the final and pull off a famous victory. And much like the first leg, this second leg is looked back on fondly. That moment that Ian Bowyer scores, it's a famous goal in Forest history, and it's one that sets them up for the final and facing Malmo in Munich.
So this was Swedish side Malmo, managed by the Englishman Bob Houghton. And I assume this was one final that was seen as a formality by most neutrals.
Yeah, I think it was at this point Forest were seen as heavy favourites, and probably for the first time in the competition were seen as heavy favourites. In all of the previous games, you could make a case for Forest slipping up or simply just being beaten by a better team, but it never happens. Forest show their European credentials, and by knocking out the likes of Liverpool and Cologne, who were probably the other two strongest teams in the tournament, Forest showed that they deserved to be in the final. And it just so happens that on paper, the name Malmo perhaps doesn't, for some people, doesn't think that make you think they're a European heavyweight, but they knocked out some big sides along the way themselves and more than earned their place in the final too. So despite that, it was still seen that Forest would turn up and win and come away with the trophy.
So the final was on May 30th at Munich at Olympiastadion. And Forest had the added advantage of being able to include Trevor Francis for this match. Now, to accommodate Francis, Clough had to drop one of his regulars, and it was going to be either O'Neill, Gemmell, or Boyer. And in the end, neither O'Neill nor Gemmell were fully fit, so Clough's task was made easier. Francis was fielded as basically a deep lying outside right. And again, Malmo were clearly overmatched and just defended in numbers. Forest attacked, but it was a poor spectacle of a match. At the time, it was regarded as one of the worst finals. And in the end, it was decided in the injury time of the first half when Francis headed in Robertson's cross from the left. That's another very famous photograph that's often referenced.
That diving header, yeah, that's the one that for Trevor Francis to come in and play his first European game for Forest and score the winning goal as he does, well, that pays back the £1 million straight away. It's a priceless goal. He says afterwards he dives in for the header and then rolls over and ends up on the discus circle, the concrete circle. Of course, the Olympiastadion was also an athletic stadium. So in going and diving in and scoring that winning goal, Francis then ends up diving onto concrete as he completes his sort of dive and lands. So that moment, yeah, it's a famous moment. The the cross from Robertson, that picture of Francis as he's just going in to dive and just make contact with the ball. Yeah, that's just a moment you can replay in your head over and over, and it's a special moment for every Forest fan, because that's really the moment that they secure glory, and that's the winning goal in the final. And like you say, the final was not the best match in terms of quality. I think Malmo's tactics were to sit in and frustrate Forest and make life difficult for them. And Forest's task was to find a goal and just find that way of winning the game, which they eventually did. And I think the Forest players afterwards were disappointed with the quality of the final, and they were disappointed that they couldn't put on more of a show for the supporters. But ultimately, the only thing that matters is that you win the cup, and that's what goes down in the history books, and Forest managed to do it.
We briefly mentioned this in the beginning, but do you think that initial win over Liverpool was that the catalyst for Forest winning the trophy in the end?
I think it was. I think it gave them the platform to go on and progress through the tournament. I mean, really, you could make a case that Forest versus Liverpool should have been the final, and the two best teams in the competition should have met in the final rather than in the first round. And nowadays in the Champions League, that probably would happen with the way that the draw is made and teams are kept apart until the latter stages. But back then, that didn't happen. You could play a team like Liverpool in the first round. It didn't matter. So in many ways, that was almost like a final in itself, that first round game. And whoever was going to win that tie would probably go on and win the tournament. And I think for Forest to go into Europe and that as their first game in the European Cup, to beat Liverpool gives them that belief that not only do they belong in Europe, but they can go on and beat the best and win trophies at that level too.
Do you know if at the time this was regarded as a one-off, or did people actually believe that Forest could repeat?
I think at the time, a lot of what Forest were doing was seen as a one-off because of where they'd come from, because it was where they were 3-4 years before. They were in obscurity and had this incredible rise through the divisions and winning the trophies they did. I think it was seen, certainly outside of Nottingham, that they probably couldn't go on and win it again. But I get the impression within the club that the players would have felt differently. They would have known now what it takes to win a European Cup, and they would have known how to deal with different situations. You look at the expectation of that final against Malmo, they deal with that. They deal with being the underdogs against Liverpool and Cologne. And in between that as well, they win games against Athens and Grasshoppers and show their quality and are able to put aside a team in quite comfortable situations. So I think they did a bit of everything in that first European Cup win, and that set them up then to go on and do it again. I think it's worth mentioning as well that 5 members of that European Cup winning team were already at Forest when Brian Clough arrived. So Viv Anderson, Ian Bowyer, Tony Woodcock, Martin O'Neill, and John Robertson were all there at Forest in 1975. And it's incredible that near enough half that team are still there 4 years later and going on and winning the biggest prize in the European game. It's remarkable, really.
In closing, more than 40 years on, how is this title looked upon by the Forest faithful, young and old?
It's still celebrated and it is still talked about to this day by all generations. Certainly the generation who were there, they look back on it fondly. And for the younger generation, I think whilst they still recognise it for the amazing achievement that it was, there is also that desire now to try and create new history. I think the European Cup wins over the years have become a bit of a millstone around the club's neck. It's raised expectations when perhaps that they weren't there to be raised, and certainly managers have come in after Brian Clough, and they've almost had to deal with that shadow of Clough over the club and the achievements that this team created in 1979 and 1980. And that will always be there. And it's something to be proud of. It's something to celebrate. But it's finding that balance between celebrating the past and using it as a springboard to create new history. And I think it's taken the best part of 30 years for Forest to get to that stage. And I think now that they are back in the Premier League, it feels like that desire to create history is there. Tap into what's gone before, but don't let it weigh you down and prevent you from achieving things in the future.
This has been repeated in other venues, other podcasts, and so on. But this Nottingham Forest adventure is again emblematic of an era where such an adventure was possible by some teams, which would be almost impossible today with all the teams built by billions and billions. But a story of a team that were in second divisions just a few years earlier, and just through the craft and shrewd management of one man, they're able to rise to the top of the continent. It's a nice story, it's a romantic story, but it's seldom to be repeated these days.
Yeah, I think the game has moved on. There's more money involved, obviously, and the Champions League has that profile now where it's the same clubs year in, year out who compete in it. In England, you've got 3 or 4 teams who are always in contention for the league. And when you look back at the time that Forest win the European Cups, you're right. It was more open for teams to challenge the best and win these trophies. So 1981, Ipswich win the UEFA Cup, for example. 1982, Aston Villa themselves, they win the European Cup, having won the English First Division the season before. And yet it just feels now that such an achievement wouldn't happen in the modern day. I think the closest thing we've had is Leicester winning the Premier League in 2016. But even then, they couldn't go on and win the Champions League after it, which just shows you how not only how difficult it is now to try and replicate the achievements of 40 years ago, but just how well that Forest team did to win the trophies and to create history how they did.
Well, with that, I would like to thank you for this interview. And I would urge everyone to please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included in the video upload description, along with our respective contact information. So thank you once more, and I hope to continue and have more discussions regarding the history of Nottingham Forest in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to it. Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, look forward to it.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you.